Dr. Uma Ramachandran is a doctorate in ecology and environmental sciences with 22 years of diverse work experience that include technical assistance and coordination of various projects related to environment and biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, environmental impact assessment, socio-economic studies and poverty reduction. She is engaged with German International Cooperation Climate Change Project at the Department of Environment, Government of Tamil Nadu. She has served as ENVIS Coordinator at Environment Protection Training Research Institute, Senior Scientist at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, in addition to being faculty for PG course on Preventive Environment Management, University of Hyderabad, and guest faculty at Anna University, Chennai. She is trained in various field-oriented techniques. She has been a resource person in several training programs. She has published many articles in national and international journals, newsletters, edited books, and proceedings.
Hello students, welcome to the UGC lecture series on environmental sciences. Now we are looking at the topic of biodiversity concepts and conservation, and the earlier section dealt with the gains and losses that is associated with a lot of changes that is occurring in the ecosystems, and we were looking at the global initiative which talks about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So, we are looking at actually the assessment number 2. We are continuing with assessment number 2, and the rest of the contents would be the other set of findings, that is your finding number 3 and finding number 4 of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Okay, so now when we continue here, we find that the degradation of ecosystem services represents loss of a capital asset. So, loss of wealth due to ecosystem degradation is not reflected in economic accounts. See, what happens is when there is development or any human intervention, we are looking at the gains obtained from exploiting the resources or using the resources, but we are not taking into the account the losses that is associated with the degradation of the ecosystem. So, that is what is highlighted here, and when we look at this, for instance, ecosystem services as well as resources such as mineral deposits, soil nutrients and fossil fuels are all the capital assets. And traditional national accounts do not include measures of resource depletion or of the degradation of these resources. So, to continue with this, for instance, a country could cut its forests and deplete its fisheries, and this would show only a positive gain in GDP without registering the corresponding decline in the assets. See, we are actually getting some benefit out of the resources, and we are adding commercial value to the products the services that we are obtaining, but then we are not taking into account how much of the ecosystem is being degraded. So, a number of countries that actually appear to have positive growth in the net savings or wealth in 2001 actually experienced a loss in wealth when degradation of natural resources were factored into the accounts. So, increased likelihood of non-linear changes is the other thing that we need to look at. There is an established but incomplete evidence that changes being made in ecosystems are increasing the likelihood of non-linear and potentially abrupt changes in ecosystems with important consequences for human well-being. See, there are lots of reports and studies have been made relating to what is the kind of loss that is occurring to these ecosystems and what will be the consequence of losing these kinds of ecosystem services which we have seen in our earlier lecture sections. So, examples of some of these non-linear changes are fisheries collapse, eutrophication and hypoxia, disease emergence, species introductions and losses, regional climate change. So, these are some of the key changes. If you look at this figure, this graph between 1850 to 2000 for instance, it shows the fish landings in tons, and we see there is such a drastic decrease towards the end in the fish landings. And the other aspect is the level of poverty, which remains high, and inequalities are also growing. See, actually when you especially we look at the developing countries, they are more associated with poverty, and we are trying to reduce poverty and we are trying to focus on these developing countries. But then we find that the inequities are growing because the rich are getting richer and the poor are becoming poorer. So, economics and human development is an important aspect. So, here we look at 1.1 billion people surviving on less than $1 per day of income. So, during the 1990s, 21 countries experienced declines in their rankings in the Human Development Index, and the access to ecosystem services is also the other aspect that is coming under the level of poverty, which is remaining high. So, this estimated 856 million people, they were undernourished in 2002 up to 32 million from actually 1995 to 97. So, look at the difference in the number of people that are undernourished over the decades. Then per capita food production, this has declined in the sub-Saharan Africa for instance, and some 1.1 billion people still lack access to improved water supply, and more than 2.6 billion lack access to improved sanitation. So, water scarcity, this affects actually roughly about 1 to 2 billion people world over. So, these are some of the issues. And next is the ecosystem services and poverty reduction. What is the kind of linkage? Under this, the factors are degradation of ecosystem services, which actually harms the poor. See, whenever there is a drastic change and lot of reduction in the ecosystem or habitats or lots of changes in the ecosystems that is happening, we find that it is only the rural poor communities who are most affected or the worst affected people. So, half the urban population in Africa, Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, they suffer from one or more diseases associated with inadequate water and sanitation. And the declining state of capture fisheries is reducing and an inexpensive source of protein in actually developing countries. So, per capita fish consumption in developing countries excluding China has been declining, okay. Even now it is further declining. So, pattern of winners and losers has not been taken into account in the management decisions. Essentially, it says that the decision making has not included the aspect of the loss that is happening to the environment and the ecosystem. Okay. So, now we move on to the other critical concerns with the associated with the dryland systems. So, here the lowest levels of human well-being and only 8% of the world's renewable water supply. Then if you look at per capita water availability, it is 2/3 of the level required for minimum levels of human well-being, and approximately 10 to 20% of dry lands are degraded. So, experienced the highest population growth rate, okay, during the 90s, and it covers almost 41% of the earth's land surface, and more than 2 billion people actually inhabit them. So, these are the dryland systems are actually an important concern too, because as and when there is lot of climate change, the regions are becoming drier, so it is not suitable for agriculture. And now we look at this map, for instance, it shows the extent of dry lands that is expanding throughout the globe. Okay, so we move on to the next finding. So, here this is we know that there are totally 4 findings. We are now in the third finding, which talks about ecosystem prospects for the next 50 years. So, under this we find that the degradation of ecosystem services could grow significantly worse during the first half of this century and is a barrier to achieving the Millennium Development Goals. We have looked at Millennium Development Goals earlier, and we know that there are some 8 important goals, and what essentially this means is, if we lose so much of the ecosystem services, then it might be difficult to achieve this Millennium Development Goals. So, when we look at the scenarios, for instance the Millennium Assessment scenarios, this is actually trying to look at the future. So, both quantitative models and qualitative analysis is used in this building up of this scenario. So, here when we look at this picture, it shows you the present conditions and trends from where you find that there are both reactive and proactive steps. So, this is the kind of approach to the ecosystem services right below and the kinds of transitions that is taking place both at the regional and the global level. So, here we find that in the reactive thing we look at the global orchestration and order from strength, and here we try in the proactive steps we look at the adapting mosaic. So, how do we adapt ourselves to the changing conditions, and at the global level it is the techno garden, at the regional level it is the adaptive mosaic. So, when many of the regions together kind of develop adaptive strategies that will help achieve at the global level. Now, direct drivers growing in intensity. So, this is talking about other direct drivers that is growing. So, most of them is degradation in the ecosystem services remain constant or are growing in intensity in most ecosystems. So, when we look at the different conditions and the different kinds of ecosystems, what are the kind of changes that has happened over the decades in the past and what is going to happen in the future is what we will look at this picture now. So, here we find these biomes. So, you have forests, dryland, inland, coastal, marine, island, mountain and polar regions. So, here you find two things, that is two aspects. One is the color aspect, the other is the arrows. We find that when we move to red to yellow, it moves from very high to low impact on biodiversity over the last few years. So, this is the result of this left side is these color boxes represent result of past evolution, and these arrows actually represent what is happening today. So, it starts from these kind of these different shaped arrows which shows you decreasing impact, stabilizing impact, increasing impact and very rapid increase of the impact. Just we will pick up one example from this picture, say forests, the tropical forests, and here we find that there are on top the habitat change, climate change, alien invasive species which I have spoken to you earlier in one of the lecture series, and over exploitation and pollution. And if we look at the arrows, the trend for these different aspects for the tropical biomes, what is happening? Habitat change is going to be very high in the tropical forests, while the actual trend is going to be the trend is also going to be very high, but the coloring is the impact on biodiversity is going to be a little less. And again when we look at the impact on biodiversity over the last decades or last century, we find that in the tropical forest the invasive species it is low, and the very rapid increase is there in the impact right now. So, this is what is happening here, and when we go to the over exploitation section of the tropical forests, we find that the impact is increasing, and also the impact on biodiversity over the last century is also high. And finally, when we look at pollution, nitrogen, phosphorus essentially, here also there is a very rapid increase of this impact, and over the last century it is actually low. We will have a short break now and go to the next section. Welcome back after the break, dear students. So, we will continue with the changes in direct drivers. So, the first aspect is the habitat transformation. Further, see actually 10 to 20% of grassland and forest land is actually projected to be converted by 2050. And when we look at over exploitation and overfishing, the pressures will continue to grow in all the scenarios. And when we look at invasive alien species, the spread is going to increase, it is continuing to increase. And in this picture we find in percentage the conversion of all these original biomes that have been listed here, from the period of 1950 loss up to the projected loss by around 2050. For instance, we look at the tropical and subtropical dry broadleaf forests here. We find that the percentage is of the original, the conversion of the original biomes, the loss by 1950, this is the orange bar here, and the loss between 1950 and 1990 is shown in red, and the dark maroon bar, portion of the bar actually shows the projected loss by around 2050, which is going to be almost 70%. So, this is a very high loss. The other aspect is the nutrient loading. So, here again in this picture you find these global regions between 1860 to 2050. The humans have actually already doubled the flow of all this reactive nitrogen on the continents, and projections are suggesting that this will increase almost by about 2/3 by 2050. Then the Millennium Assessment scenarios also project that the global flux of nitrogen to coastal ecosystems is also going to be on the increase by further 10 to 20% by 2030. So, this is going to happen more in the developing countries. Okay, now changes in the direct drives, this shows the climate change aspect. Here we find that the potential future impacts, which is that by the end of the century the climate change and impacts may be the dominant direct driver of biodiversity loss and changes in the ecosystem services globally. See, now I have also spoken to you about climate change earlier. This is going to be the added problem that we need to tackle with, apart from all the human activities which has destroyed the ecosystems and forests. So, we look at this potential impact, the future impact is there is, first thing is the loss of biodiversity, which will immediately hit the rural communities which are all dependent on biodiversity. And net harmful impact on ecosystem services is the next thing, where we see the balance of scientific evidence suggests that there will be a significant net harmful impact on ecosystem services worldwide if the global mean surface temperature will increase by more than 2 degrees centigrade. So, this is the climate change aspect. And the other factor we are looking at, degradation of ecosystem services is a significant barrier to achieve the Millennium Development Goals. So, what will be the regional concerns if we look at this is that we are facing greatest challenge in achieving these targets of the Millennium Development Goals, especially in the Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia and so on. And what is this kind of strong linkages with the ecosystem condition? Here we find that although socio-economic factors will play a primary role in achieving many of these goals, the targets are unlikely to be met without any improvement in ecosystem management for goals. Okay? So, for instance, most of these goals are poverty reduction, hunger, disease, environmental sustainability, including access to water. So, these are some of the important goals. So, we might not be able to achieve if there is no improvement in the ecosystem. So, the final ecosystem finding is going to be about the reversing of the ecosystem degradation, how best we can do the reversing. So, this finding number 4 suggests that the challenge of reversing degradation of ecosystems while meeting increasing demands for their services can be met under some scenarios involving significant policy and institutional changes. See, if we actually try and manage whatever resources are remaining right now with us, and the ecosystems are protected and conserved and are sustainably utilized, then this can definitely help in achieving or reversing the bad impacts of the degradation of ecosystems. Then many options are actually existing, for instance, the ways that reduce negative trade-offs or provide positive synergies with other kinds of ecosystem services. And see, when we look at these improvements in services, this can be achieved by about 2050. We look at the degradation part below and the improvement part above. So, in this picture, this is the changes in the ecosystem services that is mentioned in percentage. So, we looked at this diagram which showed the order from strength, global orchestration and adaptive mosaic and so on, which can all together kind of help improve the ecosystem services by around 2050. All the red bars indicate the industrialized countries and all the blue bars actually indicate the developing countries. So, 3 of the 4 scenarios actually show that significant changes in policy can mitigate many of the negative consequences of the growing pressures on ecosystems, although these changes required are large and not currently underway. See, there is a possibility of reversing this entire situation if we act now more judiciously. Okay, so now responses, importance of this indirect drivers. So, here we find ecosystems degradation can rarely be reversed without actions that address most of the changes, that is population change including growth and migration, change in economic activity, socio-political factors, cultural factors and technological changes. Collectively all these factors will influence level of production and consumption of ecosystem services and also sustainability of the production. Then what are the promising responses? Institutions, if you look at institutions, there is going to be more transparency and accountability of government and also private sector performance. So, public-private partnership, this is the key in this aspect, and there will be better governance in the future. So, this will definitely help. This is a promising response. Then economics is elimination of subsidies. So, that will promote excessive use of the ecosystem services. So, therefore, we pay, that is for instance transfer the subsidies to payments for non-marketed ecosystem services. Then the other aspect in the economics is greater use of economic instruments and market based approach in managing the ecosystem services. So, wherever they exist, for instance technology, promotion of technologies that enable increased crop yields with harmful impacts, restoration of ecosystem services, and when we look at social and behavioral aspects, change in consumption, communication and education, empowerment of groups that are dependent on these ecosystem services, knowledge, okay, this is again a very key aspect, incorporation of non-market values of ecosystems in resource management decisions, and also enhancement of human and institutional capacity. So, this aspect is to actually expand on this is that if you have the right technology which is more environment friendly, more climate change friendly, that will have a more positive impact on the environment, and also we would get extract the required production. Then in the social aspects we find the change in, so there is lot of education that needs to be involved, lot of awareness, and in the knowledge aspect, institutional capacity, all the institutions and the key actors who are responsible in managing the resources, their capacity building is also a very key factor. Now, when we look at this, actually we can get a lot of information from this Millennium Assessment website. This is the website address that is shown here, and lots of reports are available which can be accessed, and there are lots of presentations too and communication tools. So, this is how the website looks like, and just to summarize what we have looked at the Millennium Ecosystem assessments right from the finding 1 to finding 4 is some of the key things is over the past 50 years, humans have changed ecosystems more rapidly and extensively than compared at any point of time in the history. Then the changes that have been made to ecosystems, they have contributed to substantial net gains in human well-being and economic development. See, a lot of economic development has happened, but there is lot of loss of ecosystems, loss of biodiversity. Okay, and the other thing is degradation of ecosystem services could grow significantly worse during the first half of this century, and this can be a barrier in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And the challenge of reversing the degradation of ecosystems while meeting the increasing demands. So, if we reverse the degradation process by adopting proper methodologies, proper institutional governance, governance and so on, we will be able to achieve the reversal of the ecosystem degradation, so that this can be sustained for the future generations. So, these are some of the key summary of the findings. And now we move on to these questions related to the portions we have seen so far. Question number 1 is, what are the Millennium Ecosystem findings? Number 3, how do you explain the changes in direct drivers? Question number 3, what are the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment findings? Number 4. Question number 4, what are the improvements perceived in ecosystem services by 2050? Question number 5, highlight most promising responses that would be caused by reversing the ecosystem degradation. So far we have looked at these global initiative which is called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, and we have looked at the 4 findings very much in detail. So, to summarize, we have also looked at the key aspects in this, and now we conclude this particular lecture with this section, and we will move on in the next series with other kinds of global initiatives that will be taken with respect to biodiversity. Thank you.